my hatred for auto ISO is literally the reason why I'm making this video, because I see so many people shooting in auto ISO when it is, in my opinion, one of the most self-destructive things you could be doing as a sports videographer. There's nothing more exciting in sports than a good old-fashioned rivalry. Magic and Bird, Ali and Frazier, Yankees and Red Sox, the list goes on. But did you know that sports videography has its own rivalry? A little civil war, if you will, between quality and convenience. Think about it, there are so many different automatic settings in our cameras these days, from autofocus to auto white balance to auto ISO, and every time you pick automatic over manual, you're basically picking convenience over quality. So today I'm going to go through 7 different sports videography scenarios and tell you each time if you should go for convenience or quality. Let's start with focus. Should you pick autofocus or stick to manual? In this case, I pick convenience, but here's the thing. And don't worry, I won't be doing this every time, but I do think that you should use the convenience of autofocus, but not to the extent of sacrificing quality. And I know this is a wishy-washy answer, but don't worry, it's the only one, I promise. On the camera, there's basically auto settings for everything. Some are good, some not so good. But autofocus is, especially on the most recent cameras, it's one of, if not the most reliable automatic setting. So I'm more than happy to let the camera handle that side of things so I can focus my energy on other stuff, pun intended. But if you're in a situation where there's constantly players or referees getting in the way of your shot, don't just sit there and take it. Either switch to manual or at least use your shutter to stick your focus where it needs to be. When it comes to shutter speed, it's quality all day. You need to keep it consistent because on auto, the camera doesn't care about keeping your shutter speed around double your frame rate. All it cares about is the impact on exposure, or basically the brightness of your image. So for example, if you're filming outdoors without ND filters and your shutter speed is on auto, the camera is going to push it way up to make your image darker, which might look fine on the little LCD screen of your camera, but what you might not realize at the time is that a high shutter speed is eliminating all trace of motion blur, which will make your game action footage look extremely choppy. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about shooting at 60 frames per second with a shutter speed of 1/250. I'm talking about 1/1000 or even 10,000, because a camera on auto shutter speed will go that high if it needs to. By the way, later that day when the stadium lights get turned on, you'll have another issue with a high shutter speed, because a high shutter speed can't really sync up with the refresh rate of those lights. So you'll see a phenomenon called bending, which is basically what you're looking at right now. So the right thing to do in that situation is to keep your shutter speed in manual at roughly double your frame rate, or maybe a little bit higher if you like that look, and then adjust the exposure of your image or the brightness of your image using the aperture. Because making your image darker using the aperture won't affect the image quality in any way. You'll lose some of those blurry backgrounds because the depth of field is going to get wider and wider, but the image quality itself won't be affected. Now, ISO, that's the big one. Definitely quality again for this one. I mean, my hatred for auto ISO is literally the reason why I'm making this video, because I see so many people shooting in auto ISO when it is, in my opinion, one of the most self-destructive things you could be doing as a sports videographer. But anyway, let's just get into it. So basically, what I just went through with shutter speed filming outdoors is roughly the same with ISO when shooting indoors. If you're filming in a gym and your ISO is on auto, your camera won't care how much grain or noise there is in your image. The only thing your camera cares about is keeping your image as bright as it needs to be. And it will do that by pushing the ISO as high as it needs to, while introducing a lot of grain or noise in the process. But of course, some gyms are darker than others and force us to push the ISO higher than we'd like. There's just no way around it sometimes, but here are a few things I recommend you do in that situation. First of all, ask yourself if you really need to film at 120 or 60 frames per second, because every time you lower your frame rate, you also lower your shutter speed, which, like I said before, makes your image brighter, and that way you don't have to push your ISO so much. Another tip that goes without saying is to keep your aperture as wide open as possible to let in the maximum amount of light. So basically, you want the f-stop value to be at the lowest allowed by your lens. Also, have a look at your old footage to decide what ISO values are way too much for your camera. Basically, what's the limit that you should never go over because it looks way too bad. Make sure you watch your old clips on a computer to see properly what's good and what's not, and once you know what the acceptable ISO limit for your camera is, always stick to it, even when your footage looks too dark. This is one of those rare situations where it actually makes more sense to fix it in post than in camera. Because you can always fix exposure in post to a certain extent, but grain or noise is a whole different can of worms. By the way, some cameras do allow you to fix the maximum value of your auto ISO, and if that's the case for you, I guess in that situation, auto ISO is not that bad, but ultimately you want to try to stay as much as possible at the base ISO, and in auto, that just never happens. I've put white balance and color correction in the same category because I think that you should go for quality when doing your white balance so that you can go for convenience when color correcting. Let me explain. Using auto white balance in camera means that the colors in your footage are constantly changing, which makes it impossible to have any type of consistency. So if your goal is for your clips to ultimately all look the same, you're gonna have to color correct them one by one in post. But if you stick to one color temperature per location, that means everything from that location will look exactly the same color-wise. The only thing that might vary from clip to clip is the exposure. So ultimately, it makes it a lot easier to adjust the colors in post if need be, because all you need to do is just put an adjustment layer on top and just change the colors in there once instead of doing it clip by clip. And by the way, using the right color temperature is not that hard these days because most cameras have a bunch of presets for typical situations like daylight, cloudy day, indoor lighting, and so on. So just pick the right one for the right situation and stick to it. When it comes to buying equipment, I'm not going to make this longer than it needs to be, but basically I recommend that you go for convenience, which means that you should keep using the same equipment until it really starts holding you back. What you don't want to do is spend money on things in the hope that they're going to make you a better sports videographer. For example, a lot of beginners ask me all the time what platform I use for editing because they think that if they use the same one, that's going to make them, or at least give them a shot of becoming as good as I am, which I think it's actually the opposite. If you go straight for the most expensive, most professional option, you're most likely to be overwhelmed with the whole thing and give up completely. What you should do instead is start with a free or at least very cheap platform, edit the hell out of it, and when you get to a point where there's certain things you can't do with the platform you're using and it's really holding you back, then you can start spending your money on a more expensive, more professional one. And by the way, the same logic applies to cameras and any other piece of equipment. Obviously, if you already have experience producing visual effects, you should go for quality here because that's what your audience is expecting from you. But if you're a beginner and you don't have much experience with this stuff, instead of avoiding it completely, you should go for convenience. For example, you can get a subscription to websites like Storyblocks or Motion Array, which are full of very easy to use templates. Using these templates will give you a feel for quality in a very step-by-step learning kind of way. So it's a great way to learn, improve, and produce great quality content throughout that journey. When it comes to export settings, I don't care if you're a beginner or an expert for this one, you should always go for quality when exporting your videos. The idea that someone can spend hours, if not days, on a project, but then not have the patience to wait 30 minutes or an hour for the best exporting quality possible is insane to me. Please don't let your export settings be the reason why your videos look bad. Make sure you're using the right ones, and if you don't know what those are, simply click on the video appearing on your screen right now, and I'll see you guys there.